What is without doubt and beyond debate is that his family had a stellar role to play in the look and feel of New Delhi as we know it. When the British shifted capital from Calcutta to Delhi, they contracted the building of much of Lutyens' Delhi to the grandfather and father of Khushwant Singh, Sujan Singh, and his son Swapna Singh. The legacy continues from the builders of Delhi to Khushwant Singh, who too built up Delhi's heritage in a more intangible manner, the wordsmith whose daily columns everyone woke up to. Let us now get into the intricacies of Delhi's structure, its growth from the times of Tomar Rajputs in the 12th century to Mughals and the British period. I invite Swapna Liddle, who has covered it all in her book, Connaught Place and the Makings of New Delhi, and her other book, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal City of Old Delhi. And joining Swapna is Giles Tillotson, who gave us Delhi Darshan, the history of monuments of India's capital. Please come on the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. A big thank you to Rahul and Nilofer for inviting us both to participate in this. They've done, as you know, I'll try again. Okay, that seems better. Can you all hear me? Well, as you've just heard, Swapna Liddle and I, my friend Swapna and I, have both written books on Delhi recently, and of course our passion for that city is something that we shared with Khushwant Singh, though I never had the privilege of meeting him. Khushwant Singh wrote copiously and very accessibly about the city of Delhi, most notably perhaps, or notoriously, in a famous novel called Delhi, in which Delhi, the city, is actually the principal character of the novel, appearing through successive ages. And if you wanted an accessible history of the city, I don't think I could recommend a better book than that one. But he wrote many other things about Delhi too, including the text of a photographic portrait that he shared with the great photographer Raghu Rai. Now, we had thought, when we were invited to participate in this, that we each had rather important things to tell you about Shah Jahanabad, but then we were given the title of our presentation from Sujan Singh to Khushwant Singh, and so we thought we'd be true to the brief. So we're going to have to take for granted that you know all about Delhi from its foundation under the Tomars up until the beginning of the 20th century. And we're really going to both talk about the 20th century, two different phases. I'm going to let Swapna go first, because she's going to talk more about the founding of New Delhi, and then I will talk about a particular period in its later history, which I think is also significant for Khushwant Singh.
Thank you, Giles, and thank you so much to the organizers of this, especially Rahul and Nilofer, for inviting me here and this wonderful audience. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think, listening to what was being shared about Khushwant Singh in the previous sessions, I'd like to just start with this interesting, it occurred to me that he knew his Ghalib, which Sadia pointed out, he would remember that Ghalib also once wrote a letter to somebody who had written a letter to him and addressed the envelope in a very convoluted manner, giving the name of the mohalla and the kucha and everything, and he said, okay, you don't need to write all this. I'm so well known that just writing Ghalib Delhi is good enough, it will come to me. So he was quite irritated by that. So I think I really like the parallels there. One of the things I remember much before I wrote this book was a talk that Khushwant gave in his inimitable style. There was a series of lectures, basically Swapna Singh Memorial lectures, which were held, in which he gave this lovely talk saying "My Father the Builder," and that I think got published later also in Mala Dayal's edited book celebrating Delhi, and he gave a lot of what we know about the building of Delhi comes, a lot of what people popularly know about the building of Delhi comes from that little talk that he gave, in fact, of that. So what I thought was that given the limited amount of time we have today, and I hope you will go into, and you've probably read other books on Delhi, so I'm not going to give you a history of that, but just show a few pictures of, well, the first one is up there, and of some aspects which people probably don't realize. It's not very old history, but we often tend to just not know or revisit what Delhi was like, what was this process of putting it, construction of New Delhi, what did it mean really? And Khushwant of course said that, I have not studied the history of Delhi, I have just heard this from my father, from other people. These are anecdotes which I am now recalling. So I really like the fact that I myself then went later and did a proper, I did delve into the records, and I came up with the story of the making of New Delhi. But here are some pictures which, some of them appeared in the book, but these are amazing photographs. So this is something from, which shows you Delhi before New Delhi was built. This is the view from Humayun's tomb. It's the view from Humayun's tomb looking westwards. And you can see the area which is now Nizamuddin, Nizamuddin West and beyond. And you can see what kind of land it was. It was all strewn with ruins. So this is from the 1870s. I think this picture is Samuel Bourne. Could we have the next one, please? This is what is today. It's Lodi Garden. There's a bridge in Lodi Garden, Akbar Hira Bridge, and this is really what it was. It's what you see in this picture is the bridge with farmland beyond. And you can, it's not very clear, but it's clearly been farmed. And you can see the stacks of the hay, etc. also. So this was the village of Khairpur. And the village of Khairpur was then resettled. The houses were demolished and it became Lodi Garden. Next, please. The other thing that often people forget is that a lot of the monuments that we see today, Humayun's tomb, Lodi Garden, of course I showed you, they looked very different when New Delhi started to be built, and it's not very long ago. It's barely 100 years old. This photograph is in fact probably exactly 100 years old because it's from the Archaeological Survey of India took this photograph. You can see in the background Humayun's tomb again, and this is the area that we today know as Arab Ki Sarai. And Arab Ki Sarai was a proper, a whole settlement with its own post office and everything. In fact, one of the records in the Delhi State Archives is a file which deals with the shutting down of the post office of Arab Ki Sarai because it had been the address ceased to exist. They actually obliterated the village or the small suburb altogether. So this is Arab Ki Sarai. And the ASI just sort of, as part of the building of New Delhi was this whole thing of monumentalizing some of these buildings like Humayun's tomb. Next please. Similarly, Purana Killa. This is a building you will recognize. The tall building is what is known as Vijay Mandal. It's incidentally the building from the roof of which, or down the stairs of which Humayun fell and met his, had suffered mortal injuries. That's also completely filled with houses. This was the village of Indarpat, which is what, in fact, the strongest evidence that we have that this may have been the old Indraprastha that we hear of. So just as the name Indrapat and this long sort of tradition. So this was the village of Indrapat. You see it as a very interesting moment when a lot of the roofs have been taken off. So when this land was acquired by the government, the owners were told you can take away certain things like, you know, the woodwork, etc. A lot of them took away the woodwork. The building material was usually left. So the bricks and stones, and those bricks and stones actually provided the raw material for a lot of the building of things like boundary walls and the roads. A lot of the roads of New Delhi were this stone that, so in fact there was a huge saving of on the stones account just by recycling this material. And in fact this is an interesting thing to remember, that through the centuries when we've had different sites being used as New Delhi, as new capitals of Delhi, invariably there has been a lot of recycling of older materials from the previous sites. Next please. This is something that I thought would be of interest. What did Raisina Hill actually look like? Very few of us really appreciate that. So to us, Raisina Hill is the finished, product with the secretariats and the Rashtrapati Bhavan. But what was it like really as Raisina Hill? So this is the part you see of Raisina Hill being flattened on top and sort of made fit to put those buildings on. It's a fabulous picture, and you can see, of course, the railway lines that are leading up to it also to, cart the material away and to from it. Next, please. Just some of these are all photographs of the time when New Delhi was being built. So just assembled a few of them together. A combination of animal power, sort of machines being used to do the work. Next, please. Railway lines, dedicated railway lines were set up to transport the material. Next, please. Again, the construction site, a lot of cutting of stone, cranes being used. Again, tracks to transport the enormous amount of material, enormous amount of stone that was transported. Next, please. This is something, I'm afraid you may not be able to see this very well, but it shows Old Delhi, which is in black. That's Shahjahanabad, the 17th century city. And below that in red, the plans of New Delhi. And when I look at this, one particular mystery I think begins to clear itself, because what we all are often told is that Rajpath was laid out between what we call Rashtrapati Bhavan now and Purana Killa. So now the question is, if they were trying to align this road to Purana Killa, why didn't they do a better job of it? I mean, the way it stands today, Rajpath just kind of, it's like at the very, very north western tip of Purana Killa. Why not more fully align it to maybe one of the gates? And I think the answer may lie in the alignment of those particular two cities, because Rajpath is absolutely parallel to the road which we know as Chandni Chowk. So that was a sort of an interesting tidbit that I thought I should put out there. I'm open to different opinions on that. Next, please. Again, this is a picture which I think more people are aware of this, that this statue of George V stood under the canopy till the mid-60s. It's only in the 1960s that this was taken away, and after some sort of protest had happened that, why do you have a colonial symbol like this in the middle of India Gate? So, but it did stand there till then. This is a statue which probably fewer people would remember or be aware of. This is the statue of the Viceroy under whom the first transfer of capital took place, and a lot of the planning stages of the project were executed under him, Harding. And Harding's statue stood right in front of the Jaipur column. The Jaipur column is this big pillar which is in front of Rashtrapati Bhavan. And it was his statue which actually stood there. And apparently the pedestal had a to the great contribution of Harding, because again, this is something that, I don't have enough time to go into that. But Harding, in fact, was responsible for a lot of the important decisions that were taken regarding the making of New Delhi, which included, in fact, placing Rashtrapati Bhavan on top of Raisina Hill. So that is what then. Central Vista. We are discussing the Central Vista once again. All of us probably are aware of recent plans that have been announced to redevelop, to re-landscape. We have to wait and see what happens here, but I thought this picture kind of really evokes that what Central Vista is all about. It is a vista. It's a big open, and this is of course early on in its career when the trees were much smaller. But in many ways it is still quite unchanged, and it remains to be seen to what extent we can keep it unchanged. Next please. India Gate, with the first Republic Day celebrations happening. So early in the morning, the President visiting the memorial there. So all of these, of course, the buildings, including the Memorial Arch, have all been reconfigured for Indian use. It's now the said capital of an independent nation, and these have been put to new uses or related uses. Next, please. Again, I thought this is probably a memory that few would have. The Republic Day parade passing through Connaught Place. This is, I think, 56, or maybe a little earlier, might be 52 actually. But it's the Republic Day parade going through Connaught Place. Next, please. And this is something that, I'm going to end with this. It's the Supreme Court. And a building like the Supreme Court, of course, was built after independence in the 50s. But here too, the legacy of how New Delhi had been planned, the architecture of New Delhi, it's very, very much a part of that same kind of aesthetic, the same kind of look that was being carried forward in the form of these post-independence buildings like Supreme Court. So that I'm going to sort of wrap it up here, this quick slideshow through some of early New Delhi's photographs, and I'm going to give this to Giles now.
Could we change the PowerPoint, please? So one of the great pleasures of writing about Delhi is the fantastic range of architectural moments that you can focus on, and in my short book I have actually covered 1,000 years of building. There are wonderful moments, particularly for things like the Lodi period and the Mughal period, obviously, and New Delhi, as you've just seen. So can I have the first image, please, the next one. So I'm going to follow on from where Swapna left off with the Supreme Court. And in my book, a section at the end focuses on the decade of the 1980s, because I've always made it a point in writing about architectural history to make the point that architectural history doesn't end. We still produce buildings, we still produce really quite fine ones in some cases. And I think that the 1980s was a particularly exciting era, especially in Delhi, across much of India, but especially in Delhi. And it's a happy coincidence that it was also the decade in which Khushwant Singh published his novel, Delhi. So on that thin thread, I shall hang this discussion of the 1980s and try to persuade you that it is a decade worth looking at. But I need to start by stepping back a bit and saying what happened immediately after independence is you got buildings indeed like the Supreme Court, designed by Lalika, which, as Swapna suggested, is very backward looking in a sense. I mean, they're happy to pick up the threads where Lutyens left off and to try to do a slightly kind of updated version of the Lutyens New Delhi idiom. And in other buildings like the great Ashok Hotel in Chanakya, it's even more historicist. It's looking back to the approach of the Indo-Saracenic movement at the end of the 19th century, where you have scrupulously copied historical forms worked into modern design. Temple architecture is going on its own trajectory. It's saying, of course, that's the Lakshmi Narayan, so-called famous Birla temple of Myanmar, also from the 1950s. It's again very historicist, albeit with a changing technology. So that's the situation up until the mid-50s, and then everything changes because something that happens outside of Delhi, Chandigarh. You have this great beacon of modernism coming and building on the site. We've lost it somehow. There it is. This is the Secretariat and part of the High Court in Chandigarh. Unless you're an architectural historian or an architect, it's difficult to convey the extraordinary impact that this had on a whole generation of Indian architects. They were suddenly shown what modernism should look like, and many of them worked closely with Le Corbusier while he was here, or indeed, in some cases, even in Paris. So what you get after Chandigarh in Delhi, next one please, is a whole succession of architects who simply adopt the Le Corbusian mode, and they start to produce an entirely new imagery of architecture. So this was originally Akbar Hotel, it's now a university. These are both designed by Shivnath Prasad. And Tibet House, supposedly representing the Tibetan diaspora culture in Delhi. There's not a thing that's Tibetan about it. It's entirely a modernist, Le Corbusian, brutalist design. Next. So there are many others. So this is the Oberoi Hotel, which I think is a rather successful example of international modernism, and Rathan Singh's Nehru Place, which is perhaps rather less successful, though much of that has to do with its use. But so if you knew Delhi, at that time or subsequently, these buildings that are very familiar. Next. Le Corbusier wasn't the only person to have an impact. The other was the American architect Louis Kahn, who was, of course, invited to design the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and that had a similar effect, rather interesting one. So that is Ahmedabad. This, believe it or not, below, which looks almost exactly the same, as though it's a photograph of the same building, this is the extension to Modern School, designed by Jasbir and Rosemary Sachdev. And obviously they've seen the images of the Indian Institute of Management, and you get a similar kind of pastiche now of Louis Kahn rather than the Corbusier. Next. And that had an extraordinary effect, actually, in terms of the adoption of brick. Brick is not a modernist material. Brick is an ancient material, but it has certain kind of modernist imageries, or it acquired them. Suddenly, brick had been used in India since the Indus Valley. No one had thought of building, important institutions out of exposed brickwork. That just wasn't done until Louis Kahn showed you that he could do it. And so you then get Jawaharlal Nehru University built entirely of brick in the original Kokreja plan. And this, of course, is Satish Gujral's Belgian embassy, an ambassadorial building built of brick. So the whole value of brickwork changes because of Louis Kahn. There was then this moment, and this is why the 80s is important. Everybody sat back and they thought, are we really getting this right? I mean, are we actually just taking an undigested modernism and imposing it on our own country? Shouldn't we be rethinking international modernism for an Indian context? It was a moment when, anyway, some of the values of the international modern movement were being questioned in the West with the rise of postmodernist approaches. And all of those architects, like the people I've been talking about, but also Charles Corrier, I'll come to him in a minute, and B.D. Doshi, sat back and they thought, surely we should be doing it differently, but how? How can we do it differently? Because what they didn't want to do was to go back to the Indo-Saracenic movement. They didn't want to go into a sort of historicism or Asadism. It had to be something that was both Indian and modern at once. But how could you do that when you've just come out of 200 years of colonialism and the international modern movement? How do you invent a distinctively Indian modernism? Had anybody got anywhere close to doing that? Well, in Delhi, yes, there had been two. One of them, strange enough, actually another foreigner, Joseph Allen Stein, who had, in wonderful buildings like this, the Triveni Kala Sangam near Mandi House, had used all of the technologies and the language of modernism, but had somehow managed to weld it with an Indian sensibility, particularly towards the integration of the garden and the building. there's a wonderful monograph on Stein called Building in the Garden. And it's really an Indian idea that he's picking up on. And his friend and sometime collaborator, Habib Rahman, had a very similar approach at the same time, just because it's part of Rabindra Bhavan. So they, in a sense, showed that it could be done, and then others took up the theme. So next one, please. So I shall start with Correa. One of his most, Charles Correa, of course, his practice was based in Bombay, but who did do a number of buildings in Delhi. I don't think that the LIC building is perhaps the most conspicuously successful if what you're trying to do is to invent a distinctively Indian modernism, because it's with its glass walls and its space frames, it was just catching up on all of the kind of cliches of modernism at the time internationally. And I have to say this building, I mean, I think it's interesting because the way in which Correa was talking about architecture at the time was immensely inspiring in the 1980s. And as a student of architecture, down to a tie, it was all part of one kind of seamless Indian identity. And then he put up this, and they were all felt terribly kind of let down. They thought, well, you know, what's happened to this man? But he was rather more successful, I think they say on this one, is that is also by Correa, that's the British Council building. A little bit Le Corbusier, perhaps in the front, though softened by the mural by Howard Hodgkin. But look at the back, the courtyard, and suddenly we get a whole new language of modernism, a whole new approach, where you can actually see there are connections with Mughal architecture, with the courtyard approach to Mughal architecture and the kind of materials that it used, the filtering of light that it used. So a much more successful attempt there. Next. This is Doshi in Delhi, the Myth building, and from his practice it's essentially worked on by others. But Doshi had been a very dyed-in-the-wool modernist, but here in the middle of NIFT New Delhi, he puts a stepwell. Isn't that fantastic? You get this kind of, almost kind of archaeological moment where you have a reference back to tradition. And C.P. Kukreja, who had been a Carnian and had built JNU entirely out of bricks, gets the tiles out. He puts the bricks away and he gets the tiles out. Amberdeep is like a kind of sultanate tower for our times. It looks like something that's come out of Bida. An absolutely wonderful building of the 1980s. It's not well kept, unfortunately, but when it was starting new, my goodness, that was an amazing effect on the New Delhi. And then, this obviously is the most powerful building of the 1980s, again designed by a foreigner, by an Arabian architect, Saba. A difficult, challenging commission, because this, of course, is the Baha'i house of worship. And one of the, although Baha'i is, I'm sure you all know, is an inclusive faith, it is not inclusive with respect to iconography. Part of the brief to the architect is you may not use any icon that has been from any of the religions to which it forms a part. So you have to use almost an abstract architecture. Brilliant idea to use the form of the lotus, which is not an architectural form, but a deeply embedded cultural one. I think for Westernized it's a little unfortunate, the resemblance to the Sydney Opera House, but I don't think that has quite such an impact for Indianized. Next. The greatest of the offices, as it were, of the Delhi architects is Raj Rewal, and I think he was someone who was most sincere, most hard-working in this idea of blending old and new in a housing scheme like the Asiad, the Asian Village for the sports event, where he's using the urban forms of traditional Rajasthani towns like Jaisalmer. I'm going to run through the last couple of slides briefly. Next one. I think the only question that the people raised about the Asiad was, why Jaisalmer? I mean, it's the wrong colour. It's a simple point of that. So in the Scope building, this is a huge office complex for government-owned industries. He reverted to the red and buff sandstone. And thereby what Raj Rewal did is because he was using the same colour scheme as Mughal architecture, he's sort of imprinting that kind of two-tone scheme as Delhi's signature imagery. And a lot of his buildings after that use this red and buff sandstone. It's often reconstituted, actually. So that's the Scope office. And then a later building of his is the headquarters of the World Bank in the Lodi estate. I would have liked to spend longer explaining the merits of these buildings too, but I've shown you some images really, I think in the hope of saying to you, Delhi has a great moment architecturally even in the late 20th century. A lot of the concerns that I've been talking about were things about identity, so trying to establish a modern Indian identity. Architecture didn't stand alone in it. The 1980s was also the decade of the festivals of India, these great international exhibitions where curators and craft specialists kind of thought about how do we represent India, what is India, how do we show it abroad, as it were, what want people to think of it. It was a very urgent question, it seemed at the time, it was a very serious question, and it's all sort of gone. Where did it go? Because it's not as though the answer was settled, as though we all agreed this is what Indian modernism should look like and we'll just get on with that now. It all just somehow dissipated with the emergence with the liberalisation. And I think, there's much to be said for liberalisation. I'm very glad that it happened. But one of the things that it brought about was a fantastic acceleration of the development of Delhi in ways that left all of these ardent questions behind. I'm going to end there in case we have time for a question. Thank you very much. Sorry, in that reference, I hope that we've got 5 minutes for questions in case somebody has, for either of us. Well, the architecture today is best represented by Gurgaon, sadly, where I live, sadly. And whereas I think in the 1980s there was an attempt to look back, to try to recover something of a spirit of an idea that could enable you to go forward, Gurgaon architecture looks outward. It doesn't look back towards Old Delhi. It looks to Dubai and Singapore and so on, and it's the poorer for it. Do we have a...
Gilles, this kind of architecture, could be architecture of any modern city of India. But in the context of a new politics new evolving politics of Delhi, which is more democratized and which might celebrate eventually the indigenous cultures, what sort of architecture could celebrate, let's say, Prithviraj Chauhan, the last ruler of the last indigenous ruler of Delhi, or Hemu? What sort of architecture could celebrate these figures, rather than, of course, the modern emerging architecture which could be found in any city of India or the world? So that's my question.
We don't have very much from Prithviraj except some walls and, of course, the columns of temples we used in the course of Islam. And I don't think anyone would recommend going back to, a sort of atavistic temple architecture as an inspiration for the kind of new buildings that we need, the new kinds of buildings that we need. I think one of the interesting things about Delhi's architecture is the way in which architecture of different dynasties refer back to each other, so that you get a much more mixed kind of approach to buildings. There aren't, as it were, very distinct traditions. Would you agree with that? I think that the best answer is the work of Raj Rewal. I showed a few of his things. I think something like Parliament Building draws on a great range of historic traditions, and yet it's distinctively modern. So I'd like there to be more of that, but there doesn't seem to be many other architects working in that idiom.
In the sense that when people write of Delhi, they either write of British Delhi and the architecture or Mughal Delhi. But these are just the imperial aspects of Delhi. What about, the indigenous Delhi is hardly ever written about. That's my point.
I wouldn't like to make those kind of distinctions between what is indigenous and what is imperial, because that is a whole new, to me, the Mughals are as indigenous as anybody else. They are an Indian dynasty. So anyhow, those are questions but I would agree with Giles that the architecture that we see, it's an evolution of an Indian style that is happening in Delhi. We are seeing this happening. Of course, there are breaks and sort of important conjunctions like that, but it is a Therefore we have to find a way forward and decide what we want to take forward from that.
You mentioned evolution, and of course evolution there must be. Why must we slavishly follow what happened 100, 200, 300 years ago? I mean, we're talking of red sandstone, we're talking of beige, and we're talking of... In those days, materials that we have today were not available. We did not have air conditioning. Why should we not take advantage of what is available today, make it attractive? Let's move forward. Why do we continue to look backwards? And you see, Delhi today can evolve, in whichever way that the modern life and modern materials permit it. So now, you see, Corbusier did it 50 years ago, or 60, 70 years now, and look, what a beautiful city he made. I mean, why did he not, if that was so, then you'd go back to the sandstone and not use brick, as he did.
It's a matter of balance, really. I'm not advocating going backwards, but looking back to go forward. It's a question of having a sense of identity, of indeed of not producing cities that, as the previous speaker said, question has said, could be anywhere, buildings that could be anywhere in the world. I think it's by drawing inspiration from the past that you can forge a distinctive idiom for the future. That would be my prescription.
Yes, I think we are out of time on this one. Thank you very much.